So good morning, everybody. My name is Matthew Nelson. I work with Professor Bao Shimi and Casey Finnerty in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at the University of California, Berkeley. And I wanted to talk to you today about developing bio-inspired condensers to facilitate solar desalination, and a bit about what inspires us to do this kind of work. For instance, there's a current analysis that states that 2.3 billion individuals live in water-stressed or water-scarce environments, and that number is projected to increase to 3.5 billion by 2025. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. For instance, this is a continuation of this study done by the World Resources Institute that essentially surveys 167 countries, looking at methods and factors such as the increase in industrial activities, their increase in population, as well as their economic modality, basically comparing them to which country is wealthier, which country is poorer, and how that leads to the privatization of water. And then it quantifies all this data, and then it gives a projection about how much of our freshwater resources that we currently have will be depleted in the next 20 years. And all the red countries that you see before you will be depleting anywhere between 40 to 80% of their freshwater resources. And as you can see, America's not in the clear. And another interesting fact that perpetuates this issue is the fact that out of all the surface water that we use today, only about 3% of it is actually fresh. And of that 3%, only about 1% is actually accessible by humans. The rest is trapped in groundwater or polar ice caps or inside of glaciers. However, this does present a very interesting solution. If 3% of the Earth's water is fresh, that indicates that 97% is actually not fresh or salt water. So why can't we just use that? Well, that exactly is what desalination is. For instance, it is the removal of saline ions from salt water. Now, we have a couple of methods already in place around the United States and around the world. For instance, in Saudi Arabia. However, these methods are not entirely cost effective because they are very energy intensive. For instance, we have a process called reverse osmosis that basically converts electrical energy into external pressure and then pushes salt water through a membrane and separates the salt from the water. And this uses anywhere between 3 to 4 kilowatt hours per meter cubed of salt water. Now, to give a little bit of context, an average household will basically use 30 kilowatt hours every single day to power its function. But a reverse osmosis plant will use 3 to 4 kilowatt hours per cubic meter and will produce anywhere between 3.5 to 6.5 million cubic meters a day, which is an incredible amount of energy that is used to desalinate this type of water through this process. Furthermore, for every cubic meter that is produced in a reverse osmosis process, 1.4 to 1.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide is also produced. And this is considered to be the most efficient method of desalination that we have. So even though it is the most efficient, it actually has an incredibly large carbon footprint. Another thing that we have is the membrane distillation process. And essentially it uses thermal energy around the same amount as the electrical energy. And it pushes essentially salt water through a membrane, through a hydrophobic membrane using heat. And then it uses that method to desalinate water. And although this is considered to be an advancement in the amount of energy consumption because it doesn't have to use such high amounts of heat in order to actually get this process done, the commercial membranes that the water is pushed through have a very low return rate. So the water flux permeation of these membranes are only about 0.47 to 0.65 liters per meter squared per hour, which is essentially about 5% of the water that gets pushed through that membrane is desalinated. So another issue that these two methods have is that they both lead to something called brine stream. And now this brine stream is a very dense saline solution that doesn't have much applicability elsewhere. So what happens is after certain salt water is desalinated, all this brine is dumped back into the water that we use. However, this diminishes the water quality and acts as sort of a counterintuitive method of desalination. And so, looking at these processes, we're trying to figure out what is the best way to try to optimize what we currently have here. And what we propose is essentially not generating the power from an external source, but rather using the power, the types of energy resources that we currently have. For instance, the sun. And that leads us to solar desalination. right, using the natural sunlight that we already have in place to desalinate water and therefore diminish the amount of energy that we use inside of desalination plants. So the way that we want to do this is by developing something called a synthetic leaf that has zero liquid discharge. And so essentially, if you look at the tree to the far left, this is a mangrove tree that lives in very dense saltwater reservoirs, sometimes denser than seawater. But it has the ability to use capillaries inside of its roots to pull salt water through its system and then to the underside of its leaf. And then, because its leaf is porous and has the ability to filter out salt via evaporation, when the sun hits that leaf through this transpiration process, the salt water is separated, and you have freshwater vapor, and then you have salt accumulating on the underside of this leaf. Now, what's interesting is that we've been able to actually create a synthetic coupon that mimics the same properties of this leaf using characteristics of graphene oxide as well as a few other cross-linking agents. And one of the interesting things that we found is that it actually has the same type of light absorption as the leaf itself, because it also has very nice open pores, but not too large to where it doesn't separate the salt from water. So what ends up happening is that when we place this type of synthetic leaf underneath a solar simulator, mimicking the exact same amount of intensity as the sun, we find that it actually has a pretty high evaporation rate, and that it actually functions as an ideal material for sustainable solar power desalination. So some of the facts that we've been able to acquire from this is that it has a great evaporation rate, giving 2 liters per meter squared per hour in terms of its tree configuration that you see here, and which is much higher than the membrane distillation rate that we saw beforehand, which is 0.47 to 0.65. Furthermore, we see that it actually has a 78% energy conversion rate, meaning that of all the energy that is input into that leaf during this process, 78% of it goes directly to evaporating the water, which is very good compared to, let's say, solar panels, which only use 30 to 40% of their energy. Now, this is the first step. This is the precursory solution into our research. However, we want to find a way to take all this newly evaporated, purified water and condense it down for redistribution, for actual consumption. That's the primary goal of this research. And the way we're going to be doing that is by using biomimetic condensation interfaces. So our objective is essentially to use information from this Namibian desert beetle to create different types of hydrophilic, which is water-loving, and hydrophobic, or like water-hating surfaces, to basically try to find a condensation interface that will condense our type of water vapor in order for us to actually have an efficient method for creating newly filtered, desalinated water. And the really special thing about this Namibian desert beetle, as you can see here, is that it actually has hydrophilic and hydrophobic interlayers on the back of its wings. And so what it does is it lives in very arid regions, but the way it's been able to survive is by using these hydrophilic and hydrophobic surfaces and introducing them to fog-laden wind, and it allows that wind to essentially coalesce on the hydrophilic portions of its wings. And then once they get large enough, they start to drip down onto the hydrophobic portions into the beetle's mouth. And in so doing, it's able to survive with those natural resources. So our goal is to essentially take this structure and to recreate it in order to condense down water vapor that we create using our synthetic leaf. So one of the ways that we're going to be doing this is by focusing on a biophilic composition, a sort of optimized ratio of hydrophilic and hydrophobic surfaces in order to actually increase the rate of condensation as opposed to let's just having simple hydrophobic or simple hydrophilic surfaces. Now, this is a picture of how it's going to look. You have the yellow background functioning as the hydrophobic surface, and then you have these small blue protrusions on the top of that hydrophobic surface functioning as the hydrophilic spherical ball that will collect all that water. And previous research has shown that actually patterned surfaces actually have a much more higher efficiency of collecting water as opposed to non-patterned surfaces. So pattern meaning you have these protrusions and a very interesting kind of dynamic on top of the hydrophobic surfaces, or you also have pattern diagonally or pattern horizontally or vertically these types of hydrophilic portions on top of hydrophobic backgrounds that can optimize the amount of water that condenses on top of the surface. So another thing that we've learned is that the hydrophilic protrusions on these types of biphilic compositions actually increase the amount of efficiency by 60%, which is very important for us to keep in mind as we start developing new types of material. Furthermore, the dimensions of the protrusions that we're looking at should be around 0.5 millimeters. There are a couple of ranges that we could look at, primarily looking between 0.4 millimeters and 1.2 millimeters, but the sweet spot that I've seen right now is 0.5 millimeters. But what's important to keep in mind is that this data was primarily used to collect fog and dew. However, the diameter of those droplets are about 0.04 millimeters. However, our water vapor is actually going to be a little smaller, anywhere between 0.001 to 0.014 millimeters. So therefore, we need to have different types of surfaces with smaller dimensions in order to try to optimize what we're doing for the type of water vapor that we have. So the way we're going to be doing this is by using an ultrasonic mist maker to create something called a nebulizer, which will actually produce the same amount of water vapor that our synthetic leaf actually produces in our current study. And so we'll be using that mist maker to actually develop this type of water vapor, and it'll flow through a flexible tube and then hit the copper mesh or the silicon wafers that will function as our hydrophobic backgrounds. And then we'll be actually using double-sided painter's tape with hydrophobic spray to create different types of patterns, both vertical and horizontal and beaded patterns, just like the beetle I showed you before. But as that substrate starts to heat up with the condensation rate increasing, we'll be also dissipating that heat using a cooler, and we'll be using a temperature regulator as well as an Arduino board to automate the process of temperature control within that nebulizer and on top of that condensation interface. And so it'll look something like this, where you use the nebulizer and then you have the generic fan to circulate that water vapor, and then you discharge it through the acrylic tube and to the condensation interface. And then that condenses all that water into this collection bin, and then we'll be measuring the amount of change in the mass of the amount of water collected using a scale, and then that compared with the surface area of the surface interface, we will be able to create a collection rate, of our condensation interface. And this will all happen in a semi-closed chamber. And so this is our current work right now, where we've actually been able to create a communication between the Peltier cooler and the temperature regulator, and that will go onto the back of our synthetic leaf, into the back of our condensation interface, as you can see in the middle section. And then the future work will be to actually complete the entire nebulizer and to have this entire situation completed for the final phase of this project. For instance, to close the loop on the growing field of solar evaporation and to finally develop a new desalination technology. And that is our primary purpose, especially when it comes to reducing this type of thermal energy consumption that is being seen currently, using these biomimetics materials and unlocking seawater as a viable resource for countries around the world. Thank you very much.